Hello, and welcome back to the Classical Training Ground. Last time we discussed the early chapters of Genesis, we saw the war begin to emerge between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent when Cain murdered his brother Abel. Cain and his offspring proved that, despite being physically human, they were the seed of the serpent and not the seed of the woman. The seed of the woman, by contrast, turned out to be Seth, replacing his brother Abel. Whilst Cain's line sought to magnify their own name, Seth's line began to call on the name of the Lord. Now, before we focus on the flood story itself, we want to focus on the beginning of Genesis 5, which opens by saying, "This is the book of the generations." Now, this is important because our modern editions tend to divide Genesis into 50 chapters. However, if we follow the narrative structure of Genesis itself, we see 10 divisions rather than 50. Meredith Klein really focuses on each of those division beginners, which say, these are the generations, or in Hebrew, Toledot. Now, we saw this before in Genesis 2 with the creation of man. We see it here in Genesis 5 with the line of the woman. And we'll see it again right before the flood. And then we'll see that cycle again of humanity as a whole, the seed of the woman in particular, and then a catastrophe. This genealogy in Genesis 5 starts with Adam and goes through Seth's line. The pattern in each step goes as follows. When X had lived Y years, he fathered Z. X lived after he fathered Z W years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of X were V years, and he died. Then the cycle goes again with Z, and so on and so forth. For example, here in Genesis 5, 6 through 8, when Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. As this pattern repeats, everyone dies except for Enoch. He walks with God, and then God takes him. We don't know anything else about him, which made Jews of the Second Temple period so curious about him that they had to add more writings to fill in the gaps. That's how we get writings like First Enoch. The point of Genesis itself, however, is not to tell us everything we want to know. The point is to show the constancy of death for Seth's line, as well as Cain's line. While Methuselah makes it as far as 969 years, he still dies. If you've ever watched Downton Abbey, think of that line from the Dowager when she says, "I feel as old as Methuselah." Here, however, we're still waiting for Seth's line as the seed of the woman to crush Cain's line. As it stands right now, however, in this point of the story, it doesn't look like anyone is conquering anyone. Death is conquering both together. All right, so now approaching the end of Genesis 5, we meet another Lamech. Not the Lamech who was descended from Cain, but a different Lamech descended from Seth. He fathers Noah, and he says in Genesis 5:29, "Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us rest from our work and from the painful toil of our hands." Now, the word for shall bring us rest is Yenachamenu. So, think back to Genesis 3 for a second. While God had said, "Cursed are you" to the serpent and to his descendants, as we saw in the last couple of videos, he did say, "Cursed is the ground because of you" to Adam. Not "Cursed are you," but "Cursed is the ground because of you." So, could Noah finally be the promised seed in Seth's line? Could he be the one to defeat the serpent through Cain's line and establish God's dominion over the world? Lamech himself never finds out because he dies 5 years before the flood. Now, Genesis 6, 1 through 8 turns our attention back to the line of Cain as we see the sons of God and the daughters of men. We see these two groups, and the sons of God come into the daughters of men. Well, who are these sons of God? Several theories have been proposed. First, we have what's called the fallen angels theory, which means that these sons of God are Nephilim in Hebrew, which means fallen ones, and they're literally angels who have fallen from heaven, and now they're intermingling with humans. That was a popular interpretation among Jewish people during Jesus' time. Another interpretation has been that these sons of God are sons of Seth because, well, These are children of God, so wouldn't it make sense that these would be the good guys, the sons of Seth? And the problem is that they're intermingling with the line of Cain. And you could see some merit to this view because we do see instances later in Genesis when God's people illegitimately intermarry with those who are not God's people. However, in the context of the story here, I don't think that fits. So, what the view that I'm sympathetic to, of course, the view of Meredith Klein, is that the sons of God are self deifying sons of Cain. Think back over the last few chapters in Genesis. The serpent tempts Adam and Eve with a prospect of becoming like God. Cain names a city after his son. Contrasting with Seth's line calling on the name of the Lord, Cain's line tries to build its own name. Here in Genesis 6:4, uh, they're called men, not angels, men of the name, or as it's often translated, men of renown, as they call themselves sons of God. They are raping women from Seth's line as daughters of men, who, calling on the name of the Lord, show what it really means to bear God's image. Sons of God in verse 11 are said to fill the earth with violence. And in light of what's going on in Israel today, what's the Hebrew word for violence that's used here? Hamas. Now, let's think of the Epic of Gilgamesh for a second. Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, two-thirds divine and one-third human. He was said not to leave sons to their fathers, murder, or daughters to their mothers, rape. He was a violent man, abusing his divine authority to rule it for his own gain at the expense of his subjects. That's what these sons of God are doing. They boast in their names and their so called divinity while they abuse their power. Now, in response to this evil that's going on, God says in Genesis 6:3 that his spirit will not dwell with flesh forever. Again, not that he won't dwell with angels or spirits forever, but that he won't dwell with flesh forever. So this is a sin that man is doing, what these sons of God are doing. Now, for the indwelling of God's spirit, think of the Garden in Eden as the temple, the holy sanctuary. So in the Israelite mind, uh, this sanctuary is where God's spirit dwells with his people. So he's not going to do that anymore. So the dominion that Adam was supposed to spread over the world, as we've seen here, has gotten nowhere. So in verse 6:5, we see that man's heart is only evil continually. And yet Genesis 6:8 narrates that Noah found favor with God. So, as his father Lamech had predicted, would Noah be the savior of mankind? As we'll see in the next couple of videos, that answer is both yes and no. Come check that out here on the Classical Training Ground. Please like and subscribe. If you'd like to become a student with the Classical Training Ground, click the link below in the description and enter the details.